Hello, this is Mitch Mitchell of I'm Just Sharing. This is actually video number 99, and I'm doing a different topic than what I initially thought I was going to do, and I'll tell you why. I went to a YouTube channel, and these people put together what they said were the top 10 most bad villains of all time, something like that. Cartoon villains. Let me rephrase that. Cartoon villains of all time. And, I like my cartoons. I haven't seen a lot of the newer type, but I like cartoons. So I figured, well, you know what? Let's look at this. Let's see how this thing is going to go. So it named 10 cartoon characters. And all of the cartoon characters it named were probably from, at the latest, the mid-'80s up until now. Now, I knew two of the characters, and the only reason I knew them is because they were from cartoons that were older. I'm an older guy. I hate being an older guy, but I'm an older guy. And that's the only reason I knew them. They were for new cartoons, but they were characters from old times. And so I left a comment. And I left a comment basically saying, well, it's too bad, it's all this generational thing. It totally didn't mention anything about anyone beyond probably the last 30 years. And it took a lot of heat. No one liked it. The people who made the video didn't like it. Other people who popped in, they were obviously all kids, didn't like it. And of all things, that comment, no bad words, no castigation whatsoever towards anybody, got voted basically away. It got terminated. It got so many negative votes, it went away. And yet, I still got a lot of comments on it. And I said, wow, really? One of the problems I sometimes have with younger folks, I'll just say the truth, younger people, is that they have no appreciation for anything that happened before them. When I went to school, I loved history. I loved reading all kinds of things, and I read a lot of black history because, well, I'm black, but I read a lot of black history. So I knew all these different people and things that they went through in their lives to give me a better chance to work better in this world. I loved reading about World War II history. My dad was in Korea, but, if he'd been older, he definitely would have gone. And he was also in Vietnam. And so I read a lot of history. I read a lot of political stuff. I love history. I liked reading about classical musicians. I liked reading about rock musicians and different things. I've read a lot of those biographies. So I read a lot of history. I know a lot of background. And when it comes to cartoons, I've seen a lot of cartoons. I've seen a lot of the older cartoons that are way older than me. And I saw my share of cartoons up until basically the 80s, because when I went to college, I didn't get to see any cartoons anymore except old cartoons. I didn't get to see Saturday morning cartoons. And I pretty much didn't watch Saturday morning cartoons from that point on. I've seen some newer cartoons since, but not a lot of them. So I'll own up to that. But I've seen some. I have my, thing. And so I have my list of what I think are my top 10 cartoon villains. And there's some that don't count. The Coyote doesn't count. The Coyote and Roadrunner, Tom and Jerry, they don't count because they were just trying to eat. They were, if you don't have conflict between a mouse and cat, it doesn't count. Yosemite, no, not him. Elmer Fudd doesn't count because Elmer Fudd was a hunting. That's all he did. He was really a likable kind of guy. So he doesn't count. He's not really a villain. But I already gave one away, so I'll probably end up starting with him now. The only caveat I have, most people don't know that cartoons were originally made for adults. A lot of cartoons were made for adults. Even into the 70s, most of those cartoons were made for adults. Don't believe me? Go back and watch some of them. Listen to some of the topical jokes of the time. Kids weren't going to understand any of that. One of my favorite cartoons of all time is Bullwinkle. As a kid, I laughed because my dad laughed. It wasn't until I got into college and saw Bullwinkle cartoons that I understood what was going on because I knew more stuff. It was a lot funnier at that point. So anyone who says, well, cartoons are kid stuff, whatever. 1, adults make the stuff. 2, adults write the stuff. And 3, a lot of the early cartoons were for adults. They're not all for kids. Yeah, My Little Pony might be for kids. Actually, I've never seen My Little Pony, so I don't know if it's for kids or not. But it looks like it's for kids. It looks like Smurf was for kids. Powderpuff Girls. Name some others. I don't know. So, with that said, this is my top 10 list. In order of villain. And yes, some of these are from cartoons that were kind of funny. They're still villains. Just because the cartoon was funny doesn't mean they were villains or weren't good villains. But, we move on to degrees. So, let's get started. And since I mentioned him already, Number 10 is going to be Yosemite Sam. I actually had him initially at number 9, but it doesn't really matter. Yosemite Sam gets to count as a villain. Why? Because Yosemite Sam was a bad guy. He always wore a mask. He was always trying to rob someone or shoot someone or dominate somebody. He wanted riches. He wanted fame. He wanted it all for himself. It's too bad that his protagonist was Bugs Bunny because, you know, you don't start none, you don't get none. And so, you know, he would always seem to show up at a place where Bugs Bunny was, and no matter what his reputation was at the time, Bugs Bunny would thwart him. Still, he's a great villain. He came back over and over again in different incarnations. He was a pirate. You know, my goodness, he did everything. Yosemite Sam counts, and he's my number 10 villain on this list. And I moved him around, so number 9 is Snidely Whiplash. Snidely Whiplash was the villain from Dudley Do-Right. He was basically the only villain. He kept coming back cartoon after cartoon, trying to get Nell away from Dudley Do-Right. And he had the mustache, you know, the typical mustache with that hat, whatever. And he was just a bad guy. He was a villain. He was funny, but he was a villain. So he now comes at number 9. Number 8 on this list, Boris Badenov. Remember the 60s were the thing with the Russians and Americans, blah, blah, blah. The Russians want all this bad stuff. And so Boris Badenov was a Russian spy, him and Natasha, who were always trying to do bad things to Moose and Squirrel, who they saw as the prototypical American do-it-alls, goody-goody, whatever, just always wanted to beat them. Of course, he reported to someone else named Fearless Leader, but he was a great villain. He had the great laugh. He had that little pointy mustache. He had the black hat, and he wore all black. And he was smart, to a degree, because after all, it was with Bullwinkle. So Boris Badenov comes in at number 8. Number 7 on my list, if you don't have this guy on a villain list, you're totally missing the point. Bluto from Popeye. Come on, what a great villain this guy was. No matter what cartoon it was, no matter whether they made him, well, basically be a sailor, which he was supposed to be, or whether he was in the Lothario, you know, whatever, whether he was supposed to be a dancer or whether he was supposed to be whatever, he was a bad guy. He never had good intentions, ever. Even sometimes when he projected himself as good early on, it turned out he was always bad. And he was always a bully. Talk about a villain. He was always a bully. And he was a bully because he was a bigger guy and thought he could get away with everything. Popeye always had to end up smacking him down. A little bit of spinach. Great villain all the time. Even a couple times he came around. You know, it was a strange thing. A lot of folks haven't seen cartoons from the war times. When he would team with Popeye to fight the people that we were actually fighting. Some of those cartoons turned out to be kind of racist. Yeah, you don't promote that, but you have to say, you know, he was just a bad guy across the board. And even when they made newer Popeyes, he was a bad guy. Number 6 on my list, Simon Bar Sinister. Come on, Underdog. Who, you know, there's no need to fear. Underdog is here. Well, you had Simon Bar Sinister. Simon Bar Sinister was just this evil mind who would come up with these things because he wanted to take over the world. He didn't want to just take over the city. He wanted to take over the world. And so it would create all these things. And he had this great evil laugh that I just loved. And he had, God, I can't remember his henchman's name. One of you guys will come up with it. I'm sure it'll hit me later on when the video is over. But he was just a great villain, and he came back time after time with something else that he thought about. I always wondered how these guys got out of jail all the time, because no one ever said anything about, oh my God, Simon Bar Sinister has broke out of jail again. They never seemed to talk about that. They just always showed back up again. But this guy was a great villain. He was the best villain out of all of them. I know some other characters that someone might have remembered better from Underdog, but Simon Bar Sinister, he was the guy. Number 5 on the list. Now we start getting a little more serious. Number 5 on the list was Dr. Doom. Dr. Doom was a major criminal in the Marvel world. Not only, you know, did he have these powers where he could pretty much do all sorts of things, and he wore the iron mask, and, you know, just this bad guy had the cape and whatever, and he could do so many things, but he showed up in so many different cartoons. For instance, most people today have seen the movies, and we've only seen him in Fantastic Four. But he showed up in other cartoons. I saw him with Spider-Man. I saw him with Iron Man. I mean, I saw him with a bunch of different people. It wasn't just the one. So, you know, the guy crossed, you know, multiple cartoons, and he was super smart, but he had these powers as well. My goodness, Doctor Doom was definitely a great one. Now, another one from Marvel who comes in at number 4 on my list is Magneto. And of course, you know, he's a mutant who can control, well, he's got magnetism. He can control all metal. And it turns out, you know, inside people, of course, you know, a lot of folks don't know, you know, folks have some metal on. But we all are wearing some kind of metal, whatever. And he was super smart as well. And he crossed into a couple of other cartoons. So, you know, here's two bad guys who were, you know, they were just kind of worldly. They crossed into so many different areas. And I used to watch those cartoons back in the 60s and early 70s. So, you know, like I said, we're crossing boundaries now. We've gone way back. We've gone into the 60s and 70s. And now here's the newest bad guy that I have. Coming in at number 3, this is a bad guy named Slade. Slade is basically he's the evil guy in the Teen Titans. Not this very new Teen Titans that they have, which is really kid stuff. But they had this cartoon series of the mid-2000s that was called Teen Titans. My God, absolutely wonderful stuff. And the leader of the group is Robin from Batman and Robin, although they never mention Batman and Robin, but they sort of allude back to it. But this was just a marvelous cartoon series. And the bad guy who kept coming back over and over and over again was Slade. Robin was obsessed with Slade. And Slade was a smart guy who also knew all the martial arts and did all this other kind of stuff. And yeah, you know, as you're watching this and you thought, wow, this is a great bad guy, you always wonder, why is he picking on kids? Why didn't he go picking on some of the adults? Try that mess on Batman. Try that mess on Superman for once. See what happens. Still, it was very entertaining, and this was just a definite bad guy. Number 2 on my list is the Joker. The Joker was on the other list, by the way. As a matter of fact, Magneto was on the other list, but like I said, for newer cartoons. But the Joker from Batman, my God, this is a great villain. And the Joker has been a great villain from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now in the 2010s. The Joker's always been a great bad guy. He's morphed a bit. He's gotten a little more evil, a little more dark than he was before. But the Joker is just a great villain, and almost everybody who has ever played the Joker has been a great villain. It is a great part, and that laugh, I mean, you know, he laughs, he looks like he's smiling all the time. Great stuff, the Joker. Number 1 villain of all time, my number 1 villain of all time, Lex Luthor. You have to be the number 1 villain when the person you're going against is Superman, and you keep finding these ways to beat Superman, at least for a little while, before Superman becomes Superman again and remembers, hey, wait, I'm Superman. I'm supposed to be taking care of you. But Lex Luthor, he's got the fame, he's got the money, he sometimes has been legit, and yet he still wants to dominate the world or just beat Superman. Can you imagine that when you're sitting there thinking, I've got everything in the world, but I'm not Superman? And there it is. Talk about a really bad guy. Not only does he, you know, go after Superman, but all the other villains, he wants them to refer to him as the supervillain of all time. So he will align with them just to find ways to sneakily take them down later on. Come on, there's a real bad guy for you. Superman, come on. Anyway, that's my top list of who I think are the top 10 cartoon villains of all time. You notice I went from the 30s through the 2000s. I don't have anyone in 2010 specifically. I guess the Joker transcends all time periods. But I went through a whole bunch. Now, do you have any cartoon villains that I didn't mention, you know, from your time period? And I don't mind if you mention some of the newer ones now. I don't mention if you mention Scar from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I did see the movie. I never saw the cartoon, but I don't mind that. I don't mind if you mention the one from Transformers. Truthfully, I didn't even know it was a cartoon until the guy showed it. I just knew it from the movies. So I don't mind some of those things. But I'm just looking to make this broader. You know, someone wrote a comment saying, isn't 30 years enough for you? I'm sorry, I'm 54 years old. Going back 30 years basically says I got to trash the first 24 years of my life. No, 30 years isn't enough when you're a little older. 30 years is enough when you're 30, but it's not enough when you're in your 50s. So this was my list. I don't know if you watched this whole thing. I'm just putting it up there. But I hope that some of you share your, favorite cartoon villains of all time. Yeah, just talk cartoons. After all, this is a little bit of fun. Next video is number 100. What will I talk about then? Let's find out. I'll see y'all later. Mitch Mitchell of I'm Just Sharing. You take care.